What is up, guys? Welcome back to my channel where I put out a new photography related video every single Monday. So if you like this video and you want to see some more like it, you can go and check out the other videos on my channel, or you can hit that subscribe button to get a brand new video every single Monday. Today's video is going to be part 2 of the Film Photography Iceberg. So last week I did part 1 of this little graphic, which was tiers 1 to 5, and today we are going to be covering tiers 6 to 10. Now, tier 10 is sort of a joke tier, and there's only one entry in it, so we're really only covering a few tiers in this video, but I suspect it will be longer than the first video because the entries take quite a bit more effort to explain. I feel like I learned as much about film photography doing the research for this video as I've learned doing the research for all of my other film photography videos combined. So it definitely took a lot of effort, and I would appreciate if you guys like it. Hit that like button because it helps me out and it'll encourage me to make more videos like this. In fact, I have seen that there is a second film photography iceberg with different entries. So if this video is beloved by all, then perhaps I will make another film photography iceberg video in the future. Anyway, so without further ado, I would like to get started, and we're going to jump right into tier number 6. So the first entry on tier number 6 is 1/4 Black Pro Mist, and this is a filter made by the filter company Tiffin. They make a wide variety of these Black Pro Mist filters at varying grades, but 1/4 is the grade that is included on this iceberg for some reason, and it is the second least powerful grade right next to 1/8. Basically, it's a diffusion filter, it softens light, it can kind of blur out certain details, smooth skin tones, it provides this light sort of halation effect in images that gives it that old-timey look, but the black aspect of the Black Pro Mist filter also helps reduce the lightening of shadows that can be present with a traditional diffusion filter through the inclusion of tiny black particles on the glass itself. So it claims to maintain detail and shadow depth while also giving you this beautiful halation effect. And I find that it actually gives digital photography a film look. So it's interesting that people are using it for film photography, but just as good for digital photography as well. So the next entry on our list is bulk loading, and I'm not gonna lie, I was interested to learn more about it after I did the research because I'm wondering if it might be right for me. Basically, the typical 35mm film canister has either 24 or 36 exposures, and it comes preloaded on the canister. You just put it right into your camera. However, you can also buy film on bulk rolls, which are usually about 100 feet long, and you can make several dozen of these smaller 36 exposure rolls out of one bulk roll, and it can be a lot cheaper. So that means that you have to buy the blank cartridge and you have to buy the bulk roll and then spool the bulk roll onto the blank cartridge by yourself. Usually a few frames will be lost in the spooling process, but for a lot of film stocks, this loss is nominal compared to the savings that you can get by buying in bulk. Apparently, you can buy a roll of Kentmere for as low as $40, which works out to be around $2 per 36 exposure roll. So that is pretty darn good. And those are like lower than expired film prices. So if you can get 100 feet of brand new film for $40, I think it's definitely worthwhile to try it out. The next item is pull dev, and we talked about push dev in tier 1. Pull dev is pretty much just the opposite. So instead of intentionally underexposing film as with push dev, you're intentionally overexposing the film, and then you're leaving it in the developer for less time. That's the whole thing. The next item on this tier is Fuji only sells frozen film from the 2000s. And looking into this, it seems to be half conspiracy theory and half like fairly valid take. So there is evidence that Fuji stopped producing film in 2020 during the situation, and that evidence comes from UK sales manager Mark Reynolds, who has not yet confirmed that film production has restarted. So Fuji has recently discontinued a lot of their most beloved film stock, including Pro 400H, Velvia 50, and Neopan 400 and 1600. Why Fuji would discontinue these popular film stocks is a bit of a mystery unless you think of it as them running out of the stockpiles of those popular film stocks and still having stockpiles left over of their more common and accessible stocks like Fuji Color Superia. It makes sense that they would have had a larger stockpile of easier to produce films like Fuji Superia, so the conspiracy theory does hold a little bit of water, I think. And because it's so opaque about when film production will start, or if it has already, either way, it's probably a good time to stock up on your favorite Fujifilm products and keep them frozen until you can sell them on eBay, until you can shoot with them. The next item on tier 6 is death before digital. I assume that this is a self-explanatory statement and it's referring to some film photographers' unwillingness to switch to digital, but it could also refer to this, which is an independent publishing platform that caters to contemporary film photographers with a strong visual aesthetic. Oh whoa, what a strong visual aesthetic. I actually thought that this looked cool at first, but then I realized that all of their exclusives featured the same scantily clad woman that I spent 27 minutes ranting about a few videos ago. Oh, except this one, which is just somebody stepping on a woman's head. It doesn't really seem to be pushing the boundaries of the medium in the way that it claims to, but it also seems like this publication is defunct, since they only ever ran 6 articles and their last Instagram post was in 2017. So cool idea for a publication, but I don't like it. Cross-process. Cross-process is the act of intentionally processing a film in the wrong developing chemicals, which creates unpredictable color shifts and increased contrast. We talked about slide film in the last video, which uses E6 as a development process, so processing slide film in C41 would be a form of cross-processing. Likewise, processing a C41 film in E6 would also be a form of cross-processing. Processing slide film in C41, I believe, is the most common form of cross-processing because you're essentially taking a film that typically has a very expensive development process and processing it as cheaply as possible and getting interesting results in the process. So that's cool. The results are pretty neat looking and they do definitely give 2000s music video vibes. And that concludes Tier 6. Moving on to Tier 7. So the first entry on Tier 7 is Everything is Ilford. And looking at the Ilford website, it actually does seem like this is possible. They sell pretty much everything you would need, from cameras and film all the way into development and darkroom supplies and accessories. They have tanks, they have home development, they have really, really niche stuff that I have no idea how you would use. You can actually have everything be Ilford, and they have photographic paper and stuff, so even the prints that you make can be Ilford. They also manufacture really, really cheap black and white film stocks. I'm sure you know this if you're watching this video, but if you want to shoot film and you don't have a lot of money, that's a great place to start. Also, don't shoot film if you don't have a lot of money. Trust me. Next, we have stand development. And this has also been referred to as lazy development, which I think is a bit of a pejorative because I would consider lazy development to be dropping it off at London Drugs. And anything beyond that is not lazy in my opinion. But anyway, stand development is a technique that involves using a watered down development solution and leaving the film in the developer for a much longer period of time. The goal of this technique is to create a well-balanced exposure in the highlights and the shadows. So basically this works because the developer exhausts itself in the highlights first and the shadows will continue to develop, which apparently brings out more shadow detail than might otherwise be possible with traditional development techniques. Next we have alt process, and oh my god, this is a rabbit hole. I think I'm gonna make a video on this at some point, but alt process refers to any non-traditional or non-commercial photographic process, which there's a lot of them. There are a lot of them. There's wet plate process, gum oil, Van Dyke brown, cyanotype, which I recently had the pleasure of trying out with flowers and leaves, picked from my partner's family farm, which is a very wholesome cottagecore process that definitely got my heart rate up when it started to develop before I had finished putting the leaves and flowers on. Here's the result though. There's also carbon print, daguerreotype, palladium printing, chemigram, liquid photographic emulsion, infrared, and the list goes on and on. And I'm going to leave it there because I actually do want to make a video about all the different types of alt processes in the near future. Next we have canned chemicals, and I couldn't find much about what made canned chemicals special. This is kind of me taking a guess based on what I read, but I think that this is referring to wholesale or bulk chemicals, which tend to come in large industrial-sized cans rather than the tiny boutique bottles that chemicals purchased from retail stores tend to come in. So if you're buying canned chemicals, the assumption is that you're buying a lot of them at a time and hence developing a lot of film at a time. This is what I assume because maybe I'm Googling the wrong things, but I can't find anything about canned versus uncanned chemicals, one being better than the other, or differences, or whatever. Moving on. Another one that I can't find much information about is infinite resolution WPC. And in fact, I cannot find any information about this. I looked up like the Google search infinite resolution WPC, and the only mention of it on the entire internet is a comment on the Reddit thread where I originally found this iceberg asking for somebody to explain it. And that comment, when I last saw it, had 17 upvotes and not a single response. So no, nobody could explain it. WPC stands for World Photographic Cup. I'm not sure if that's what they're referring to in this entry, but it was founded in 2013 as a way to unite photographers in the spirit of friendship and cooperation. Most of the entries and the past winners are absolutely gorgeous masterclasses in photographic art, and for the infinite resolution part of this, I have no idea how that relates. You can't actually get infinite resolution out of film because the size of the individual grains on the film, the particles essentially limits the resolution, but you can get pretty crazy resolution when you get it to large format, so maybe that's what it's referring to. I don't know, your guess is as good as mine. If somebody in the comments wants to hazard a guess as to what infinite resolution WPC stands for, please let me know. And that's the last one on Tier 7. Now we're moving on to Tier 8. The first one on Tier 8 is two-part developers. And this is another one that's going to take a little bit of explaining. So usually in a single bath developer, the developing agents and the accelerator are placed in the single bath, which means as soon as the film is placed in the solution, it begins to develop. In a two-part bath, the accelerator is split from the other agents. The preservative and the developing agents are placed in bath A, and the accelerator is placed in bath B. The film is absolutely not pre-soaked before being placed in bath A, so that it can act as sort of a sponge and soak up the developing chemical. Then, when you place it in bath B, it's got that finite amount of developing chemical that it's been soaked in, and it will eat through that and begin to develop. This method is used to achieve a more even contrast overall and a better balance between highlights and shadows. Because the highlights will burn through the developer faster than the shadows, but because they have access to a limited amount of developer, they will then stop developing and allow the shadows to catch up. Imagine it like two people running a race. If you give them X amount of time and measure how far they can run in that amount of time, highlights can run a lot farther. But if you give them X amount of distance and just allow them however much time they need to run that distance, then they can both run the same distance and just take different amounts of time. I don't know if that makes any more sense. Let's move on. Next, we have Ilford color. And this, I'm going to say the word rabbit hole a lot in this video. This was a bit of a rabbit hole as well. So Ilford did, at one point, produce color films. It seems like they kind of sucked at it, and that's why they stopped, and they've just never started again. The first film stock that Ilford created that was a color film was created jointly with Dufay Limited, and it was called Dufay Color. And it was introduced in 1935 and phased out in the late 1950s when other more popular forms of color film came onto the market. This used an additive color process rather than a subtractive color process, and it was essentially a black and white image viewed through a mosaic of colored filters. Hold on to that because we're going to talk about potato color in a second, and I think it's a pretty similar concept. But Ilford also made other color films later on. It made a slide film called Ilford Color Slide, very on the nose there, which was similar to Kodachrome. And in 1948, it introduced a non-substantive color film called Ilford Color D, and later improved the film in 1960 and released Ilfochrome. But from what I read, it sounds like Ilford never really hit the mark with its color film stocks and eventually pulled the lines and focused on what it was good at, which was black and white films. Next entry, we have potato color, and this is hilarious. This was the very first viable method of producing color photography. There were processes for color photography before, like trichrome, which we are going to talk about in Tier 9, but it was very clumsy and unwieldy and took a lot of effort to get right. So potato color offered a much easier solution to the problem of creating color on film. This potato starch method involved dyeing potato starch 3 different colors: blue violet, green, and orange red. And those potato starch colors would then be mixed together and used to coat a glass filter, creating a tiny mosaic of different colored potato starch particles. The starchy side of the plate was then covered with a thin layer of silver gelatin bromide, and the plate was then loaded into a camera in such a way that as light passes through the camera, it hits first the glass, and then the potato starch, and then the silver gelatin bromide. This would then be developed as a transparency that could produce an image in color. This method became known as autochrome and would become the color photography standard throughout the 1930s. Next, we have Miroslav Tichy, who is basically a character from Mad Max. Like, actually. He used these terrifying homemade cameras to take photos of women who did not know that they were being photographed. And the results are creepy, and he is creepy, and the cameras are creepy, but you do have to hand it to him that the fact that this worked, I mean, he would use tin cans and cardboard tubes and bits of scrap wire and twine to create these actual functioning cameras, and it's thought that a lot of the women who posed for photographs actually struck a pose because they didn't know that the camera was actually functional, and they thought it was just a crazy old man with a piece of cardboard pretending it was a camera, and they were probably humoring him. And oh my god, I don't believe in separating art from artists, but in this case, let's just do that for a second and look at these photos because they are really, really interesting lomographic specimens, and I think it represents a fascinating chapter in the history of photography and lomography. I would personally love to try making my own homemade camera out of bits of twine, but I feel like if you gave me all of the resources that I needed in the world and 100 years to do it, it would take me like at least 6 months to figure it out. And that brings us to Tier 9. And the first entry on Tier 9 I referenced earlier, it is trichrome. So trichrome was the predecessor to potato color, and it was the original method for creating color photographs. Basically, it involves taking 3 black and white images through 3 different colored filters, red, blue, and green respectively. Because each filter blocks out a different amount of light, you need to meter each photo differently, and you also have to keep the camera in the exact same place and make sure that there's no movement in the frame, otherwise the colors will not match up. obviously. Traditionally, you would have to develop each photo and then project it through a projector with the corresponding glass filter. So the photo that was taken with the green glass filter would be projected through a green glass filter. And you would layer all three of those projected images on top of each other, and that would produce a color photograph. You see what I mean why this is like totally unwieldy and not really practical for the average person. Well, now we have Photoshop, and you can actually do this yourself if you buy red, blue, and green colored filters. You can take these pictures and then bring it into Photoshop and just change the channels and layer them on top of each other digitally, and the results are pretty darn cool. Next, we have scratch mix chemicals, which is mixing chemicals from scratch. And yes, people do actually do this. I've seen a lot of comments debating the utility of mixing your own chemicals, because apparently you wind up with pretty similar results to those that you can buy in store, and it just takes a lot longer and it's a lot more finicky and there's a lot more trial and error. But you can save money doing it if you buy raw chemicals and mix them yourself, as long as you already have your formulas down pat, because apparently the experimentation of guessing and testing and developing and wasting all these chemicals in that process can really eat through the savings that you would otherwise incur. Scratch mix enthusiasts tend to be more into photochemistry and just chemistry in general than into photography. I've seen a lot of discussions where you have one person who's really into the hands-on side of photography, and then a bunch of people who are into like the capturing side of photography who just think it's a waste of time. I don't think it's a waste of time if it's something that you have fun doing. It sounds like some people do. But in terms of like, is it better to mix your own chemicals from scratch to save money? It seems like the consensus is no. Next, on tier 9, we have film washi, and we are really getting down there, aren't we? Film washi is the world's smallest film manufacturer. Claims to be, anyway. They were launched in 2013, and they have some pretty cool looking handcrafted films, but I admit that I don't really understand a lot of the words on their handcrafted films page, and the research for what those words mean was beyond the scope of this video. But they also have a bunch of really cool specialty films, and these are films that have been appropriated from other uses, such as for x-rays or surveillance, and they've been appropriated to be used for artistic purposes, which is pretty cool. These films include a maskless color film that has a very warm, beautiful color toning that's reminiscent of the 40s and 50s color photography. They also have a medical fluorographic X-ray film, which has been used in the past to diagnose lung diseases in the Russian countryside. And they also have a surveillance film that has been used for like Russian surveillance operations, and it's currently unavailable due to the escalating military crisis in Ukraine. So the YouTube channel Analogue Wonderland has a lot of really fun videos testing out these films and just talking about them, so if you're interested, go check that out. It's linked in the sources below, and it was also a great distraction to watch those videos instead of proceeding with the rest of the research for this video. So the next entry on tier 9 is uranium, and yes, you can make photos with uranium. There's two different photographic processes, and both of them rely on the fact that uranium is radioactive. And what this means is that it decays, and as it decays, it emits alpha and beta particles as well as gamma radiation. Now, that radiation actually exposes certain kinds of photographic film similarly to how light, which is also a form of radiation, exposes regular photographic film. And so if left on a piece of film for a prolonged period of time in the dark, uranium will actually cause that film to expose, and it leaves sort of a footprint behind that looks like something you would see in outer space, which I think makes sense, because I think a lot of photographs that are taken of outer space are actually photographs that are radiation prints. So it's sort of the same process, but on very different scales. But yeah, so those are very cool, and these are called autoradiographs. There's another form of uranium photographic printmaking, though, and it's called uranotype, which does not involve soaking film in pee like it sounds. This is actually a very early form of photographic processing in which the paper is sensitized by soaking it in a bath of uranyl nitrate. Not this. It's actually a uranium salt, which is then exposed to UV light, creating the image. The resulting image is then washed in a ferrocyanide solution, and the photo develops due to the production of uranyl ferrocyanide, which means, yes, that there is both uranium and cyanide in these prints, but the cyanide is in the form of ferrocyanide, and that doesn't tend to release actual cyanide, so it's not as toxic as other forms of cyanide, so don't worry about that part. But the uranium is a questionable ingredient. The resulting image has a brown sepia tone that you're probably familiar with if you've seen a lot of photos that were captured in the 1800s. And while there are multiple photographic processes that can produce this sepia toning, uranotype is certainly one of them. And our last entry on tier 9 is entire kitchen is dark room. This is exactly how it sounds, although I would probably turn my bathroom into a dark room before my kitchen, because I don't want to have to tape up the kitchen window, and bathrooms tend not to have windows in them, so take my advice if you will. And that brings us to tier 10, and tier 10 is kind of a joke tier, and it only has one entry in it. And the entry is actually incredibly hard to read, but it says Ansel Adams would have used digital. and I do believe this to be true. Ansel Adams is one of the gods of film photography, but unfortunately he died before the advent of digital photography made it to the mass market. He never got the chance to shoot digital, so we can't really make assumptions. But we can, because his whole thing was pure photography. He was totally bent on this idea of capturing things with as much detail and fidelity as possible, and digital cameras allow you to do that to a greater extent than film. And if he were alive today, he would probably be shooting with something ridiculous like a medium format Hasselblad digital or the LS911 Mark II. And that brings us to the end of the video. That was a lot of work. That was a lot of talking, a lot of research went into this. If I got some things wrong, don't hesitate to correct me down in the comments. A lot of this stuff was very new to me, as I'm sure a lot of it is new to you as well. There are a lot of cool things that I learned about that I would love to do informational videos on in the future. If you have any suggestions for things in this video that you'd like me to talk about more, I would be happy to, because this kind of research is right up my alley. Thank you guys again for watching. I super appreciate it, and I will see you guys next week. I think next week will probably be more of a chill vlog style video, but we'll see, I'm not sure. And in the meantime, I want you guys to stay sharp and don't forget to keep shooting. Bye guys.